All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Jerry and Sarah Wolaski, in the Schos of Refuah Shlema for Zechariah Dov Ben Perel Shira, Shindy and Avram Kelman, in memory of their beloved parents, and the Schos of all of those who need a Refuah Shlema. Dr. Linda Weinberg, in loving memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz Moshe Ben Avram. Selma Wolf, with immense gratitude to Hashem, with tefillos for health for all in the new year. And Leah Soul as a schos for Refuah Shlema for her daughter, Ilana Bas Esther, and for all those in need of Yeshuas. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Jacob and Julie Blumenfeld, with gratitude to Brian Newman for being awesome. That's not my words; those are their words, which is great. What a beautiful gratitude, a beautiful dedication. Sponsor Daf Yomi in honor of someone being awesome. Okay, Baruch Hashem, halavai, we should all be zocha. Should all be zocha to receive such a dedication. All right, Rose, let's begin. A lot to do today. A lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, an incredible daf ahead of us. So today's daf is Lamed Zayin 37, and we are picking up Emeretz Hashem on Lamed Vav Amud Beis 36b at the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says as follows: Kol mitzvah she'tili baris. We'll say, so now, just so you understand and appreciate the theme, so after going through a number of Mishnayos, a number of different discussions about mitzvos that men are obligated in, the women are obligated, or I should say the women are obligated, women are exempt, the Mishnah continues on this theme of creating different categories of mitzvos. So says the Mishnah, Kol mitzvah she'tiluya ba'aretz, any mitzvah which is dependent on the land. Now we're going to define the exact nature of that statement, what that means. But any mitzvah that is dependent on the land, so the Mishnah writes, Eino nohages ela ba'aretz, only applies in Eretz Yisrael. But any mitzvah that does not apply in the land or to the land, nohages bin ba'aretz bin b'chutz la'aretz, applies both in Eretz Yisrael as well as outside of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, like I said, we'll define exactly what this means in the Gemara. Top of Lamed Zayin, chutz min ha'arla, with the exception of arla. So let's remember again, arla is the prohibition to eat the fruits of a tree. For the first 3 years after it's planted. So the Mishnah suggests that halacha l'maisa, arla applies in chutz la'aretz as well. Take a look at Rashi. Chutz min arla va'kilayim. Kilayim refers to forbidden mixtures, right? So remember again, the typical example of kilayim is like kilaya kerem, like planting grapes and wheat in close proximity. But it really represents again the intermingling of different species. Again, we'll get a little bit more into this in the Gemara as well. So we'll say, so here's what the Mishnah has just done. The Mishnah has created a category. There's something called mitzvos hataluyos ba'aretz, which are mitzvos which are dependent on the land. Again, that phrase still needs more specific definition, but mitzvos that apply to the land only apply in Eretz Yisrael, not in Chutz La'aretz. Mitzvos which don't apply to the land, ultimately again apply in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Exception to the rule, arla and kilayim, which although again they are mitzvos related to the land, halacha l'maisa apply in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael, which means that, for example, outside of Eretz Yisrael, what the Mishnah seems to be saying is, if you planted a fruit tree, you would be prohibited to partake of the fruit for the first 3 years after you plant that tree. Similarly, again in Chutz La'aretz, you would not be permitted to go ahead and intermingle different species of plant life as well. Again, we'll define the parameters. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Af HaChadash. Rabbi Eliezer says this also applies to Chadash. Now we'll say Chadash, and this is actually going to be more tomorrow's sugya, which is a really great sugya. So what is Chadash? So remember again, in the world of grain, in the wide world of grain, so the way it works is that halacha l'maisa, anything that's planted after last Pesach, right, is called Chadash. So let's just chart this. So you have Pesach, for example, Pesach Tafshin Pei Gimel, Pesach 5783. So after Pesach 5783, I planted wheat, right? So now what happens? From Pesach 5783 until the bringing of the Omer in Pesach 5784, the carbon Omer was a barley offering brought on the second day of Yantiv. So grain planted after Pesach 5783 until the Omer is brought in Pesach 5784, that crop is called Chadash. After you bring the Omer on 5784, that crop now becomes referred to as Yashan. That's the concept of Chadash and Yashan. So Rabbi Elazar says, even Chadash. Now, we'll say, we're going to see, there's going to be a major machlokes as to what exactly Rabbi Eliezer is saying. Right? Is he including Chadash in the category of Arla and Kilayim? Is he putting it in a different category? That we'll see. Right now, we'll just translate the words. Rabbi Eliezer says, even Chadash. Okay, we'll say, that's our Mishnah. The incredible Mishnah, you can tell, both say, you can tell already by a Mishnah like this, there is good stuff coming, right? A lot of fascinating discussion. So first, the Gemara begins, we both say, Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph 37a, second line down from the top. The Gemara says, let's first go ahead and focus on definitions. So says the Gemara, "My teluya or my she'ina teluya." What does it mean when we're speaking about a mitzvah hatuluya? Remember again, how would you translate the word teluya? Teluya means dependent on. What do you mean when you say a mitzvah dependent on the land versus a mitzvah that's not dependent on the land? My teluya, my she'ina teluya. So ilema teluya d'chsiv be bia, v'she'ina teluya d'lo ksiv be bia. So I'll say maybe teluya means a mitzvah that the Torah discusses bia. We'll say what bia in this context means what? Entry into the land. So perhaps a mitzvah hataluya ba'aretz is a mitzvah in which when the Torah discusses the mitzvah, it's discussed in the context of arriving in Eretz Yisrael. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Tluya d'chsiv be'bia, shetlah hakasa be'bia sa'aretz kigon kisavou ki yevi'acha." See, that's what it means. So a mitzvah tluya ba'aretz means a mitzvah that when you find it in the Torah, the way it's discussed is it's a mitzvah that occurs when you enter into the land, versus a mitzvah she'ina tluya ba'aretz, d'lo ksiv be'bia. So eina tluya ba'aretz means a mitzvah she'ina tluya ba'aretz, a mitzvah that's not dependent on the land, is a mitzvah where the Torah doesn't link the mitzvah to the coming into Eretz Yisrael. Here's the problem with that. Hari tefillin upeter chamar. Now let's say when you take a look at the mitzvah of tefillin and the redemption of a firstborn donkey, tichsiv be bia. Let's say for both of those mitzvahs, interestingly enough, the Torah discusses arriving in Eretz Yisrael. So it says arriving in Eretz Yisrael. Take a look at Rashi. Peter Chamar, Rashi says, ksiv behu v'haya ki yevi'acha beparshas kadeshli. So I'll say, interestingly enough, both tefillin and Peter Chamar, the Torah uses lashon when you come to Eretz Yisrael. They both say, now clearly, what would you say, that those are mitzvahs hatuluyos ba'aretz? So it can't be that the definition of a mitzvah hatuluya ba'aretz means a mitzvah in which it's discussed in the context of coming into Eretz Yisrael. Because sometimes the Torah just speaks about mitzvahs in the context of coming into Eretz Yisrael, because coming into Eretz Yisrael represents becoming an autonomous, responsible nation. So rather, what does it mean? So the Gemara says, and yet we know that everyone agrees the mitzvah Peter Chamar, of redeeming firstborn donkey, right, and tefillin apply both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. So what's the definition? So Rabbi Yehuda, this is what it means to say, Kol mitzvos shehi chovas haguf noheges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So we'll say, here comes Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says like this, a mitzvah, there are different types of mitzvos. There's what's called a mitzvah chovas haguf. Chovas haguf, it means a mitzvah that is a responsibility on the person. Literally, again, a mitzvah I perform with my body, chovas haguf, an obligation upon me. So ultimately, again, that applies in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Versus chovas karka. Let's say then you could have a mitzvah the mitzvah itself is on the land. Such a mitzvah like that, eino nohages ela ba'aretz. That type of mitzvah ultimately only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Chovas haguf. Rashi says, Hainu eina tluya ba'aretz. Eina muteles ala karka v'lo al giduleha ela al gufo shel adam kigon Shabbos, tefillin, avodas kochavim, peter chamar, Mila arayos kiyotzeba. So we'll say here, so this is actually quite interesting. So Rabbi Yehuda says there are two different categories of mitzvos. There's what's called the chovas haguf and chovas karka. Chovas haguf means mitzvos incumbent upon the person. Upon the person. Literally, I will say there are mitzvos that I perform with my body versus mitzvos which are performed with the land. So for example, tefillin. right? Again, Rashi's examples over here. Tefillin, bris milah, avodah zara, that's in the avera category. Peter chamar, right? These are chovas haguf, and ultimately, again, chovas haguf apply both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Versus chovas karka. So look at the next Rashi. Chovas karka. Rashi says shmu teles ala karka o giduleha. So these are examples of mitzvot that are upon the land or on that which grows from the land. Kigon trumas umaisros shatruma meiser chala leket shichacha peah shvius shmita, right? Chadash arla kilayim. So again, we'll get into arla kilayim in just a little bit and chadash. So we'll say so these are our categories now. What I do want to share with you is something very interesting. So you have two different categories. So it's a very simple distinction. So you have Shemitah, right? Shemitah is on the land. Shumas and Maisrus, on produce. Now, just to be clear, even those things that are quote-unquote Chovas Karka, they're still on me, right? In other words, these are my responsibilities to perform. But what it's really saying is the obligation of the mitzvah is only triggered by the land itself. It's not on the individual, it's triggered by the land. So two different categories of mitzvos. Chovas haguf and chovas karka. Chovas haguf, mitzvos that are incumbent upon the person himself, meaning he performs them with his body. Ultimately, again, those apply in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. Mitzvos that are only triggered by the land, those are only incumbent upon, those are only apply in Eretz Yisrael, not in Chutz La'aretz. Fine. So we'll say, how do we know to make this? How do we know to make this distinction? Says the Gemara, the Torah Rabbanon, Eila Chukim. So we'll say the Gemara quotes the pasuk. The pasuk is Eila Chukim va'mishpatim asher tishmurun la'asos ba'aretz asher Hashem Elokecha asher Hashem Elokei Avosecha asher Hashem Elokei Avosecha. Asher nasan Hashem Elokei Avosecha l'cha l'rishta kol hayamim ashertem chayim ala adama. So that's the pasuk now we're going to dissect. So watch this. Says the Gemara, Eila chukim. What are chukim? Eila hamidrashos. These refer to the halachos, ultimately, again, that Chazal learn out from drashas. So not necessarily mitzvahs that are explicitly written in a pasuk, but rather they're learned out. Vamishpatim, what's that? Elu adinim. These are the halachos that are a bit more explicit. Asher tishmerun, zu mishnah. Ultimately, Rabbi says, so what's tishmerun? Tishmerun refers to the obligation to learn Torah. La'asos, ultimately, again, this refers to actions. Maisa, right? Ba'aretz. So when it says ba'aretz, yachol kol hamitzos kulan lo yunogos ela ba'aretz. So there's an interesting havamina. You might have thought that all mitzvos only apply in Eretz Yisrael. I will say, so just by the way, just the fact that there's such even like a havamina like that is fascinating, right? I might have thought that where does Torah apply? Where does Klal Yisrael have Torah? In Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, right? The Gemara says, Talmud Omar, Kol Hayomim, Asher Atem Chaim Al Ha'adama. Then Rabbi says, pasuk says, all the days in which you live on the earth. What does that mean? Rabbi say, Al Adama. Adama means anywhere. Anywhere, which tells you that Torah is incumbent upon a person wherever they are. I will say again, I can't say enough. Just the Havamin itself is quite overwhelming. Okay, fine. Nevertheless, so I'll say if based on the phrase Kol Yomim, then I might have thought that all mitzvos apply both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. Talmud Lomar Ba'aretz. Therefore, what the pasuk says Ba'aretz. So I will say, now what you have essentially are contradictory inferences from the pasuk. On one hand, the pasuk says ba'aretz, which would have led me to think that what? Mitzvos only apply in Eretz Yisrael. Then it says, Chal yom asher atem chayim ala adama, all the years in which you live on the earth, which would seem to indicate to me that what? That mitzvos apply anywhere and everywhere. So which one is it? Do mitzvos only apply in Eretz Yisrael, or do mitzvos apply everywhere? To which the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar ba'aretz, so now that the Torah went ahead and had a ribui and a miyut, let's look at the pasuk itself. So I will say, what else does it say in this pasuk? And this is incredible. So I will say, the very next pasuk, the pasuk we just quoted from, Avela Chukim, that's Dvarim Perikid Beis pasuk Aleph. The very next pasuk, Dvarim Perikid Beis pasuk Beis, says, Abeid ta'abdun eskala makomos asher avdu sham. I will say, then afterwards the pasuk says, destroy avodah zarah. Destroy avodah zara. Now watch this. Says the Gemara. Ma avodas kochav miyuchades shichovas aguf. We'll say just like idolatry is unique. We'll say now what's the nature of idolatry? Or I should say, remember again, idolatry is in the avera category, as we know. But what's unique about idolatry? How does one perform idolatry? With their body, right? With your person. With your person. So ma avodas kochav miyuchades shichovas aguf v'noheges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. Just like idolatry is unique, is that again is what we call chovas haguf. It's on the person. In other words, we both say the prohibition of idolatry is triggered ultimately again by personalistic physical activity, by something I do with my person, and it applies in Chutz La'aretz and in Eretz Yisrael. We create a paradigm from this. We also what we call a binyan av, a paradigm. Af kol shichovas haguf noheges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So too again, both say any mitzvah that is a chovas haguf applies in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. So I both say this is really fascinating because I think even before coming into the daf today, all of us knew these categories, right? You could group mitzvahs in two basic categories, chovas haguf and chovas karka. There are mitzvahs that are dependent upon the individual, right? That again are incumbent upon my person. I perform with my person, with my body. And then there are other mitzvahs that are triggered by the land. So mitzvahs triggered by the land only apply in Eretz Yisrael, although we'll see some exceptions to that. Mitzvahs ultimately again incumbent upon my person or performed with my body apply both in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. And I will say, so now we have this source for this. Where do we learn it out from? So we'll say once again, it's Devarim, Perek Yud Beis, Pasuk Aleph. So what do I have? So a pasuk that teaches me contradictory inferences. On one hand, the Torah says, perform the mitzvahs ba'aretz. But then it also says, which seems to indicate mitzvahs only apply in Eretz Yisrael. Then it says, Kol hayomim asher atem chayim al ha'adama. All the days in which you dwell on the earth, which seems to indicate that where do mitzvahs apply? Everywhere. So which one is it? Let's look at the very next pasuk. What does the very next pasuk talk about? Avodah Zarah. And it tells you that Avodah Zarah ultimately again destroy Avodah Zarah. Destroy Avodah Zarah. Don't worship Avodah Zarah. Now so what the Gemara is noting is the juxtaposition of Avodah Zarah to the previous discussion. What's unique about Avodah Zarah? Avodah Zarah is a chovas haguf, right? In other words, it's a prohibition on the person and ultimately applies anywhere, right? Chutz La'aretz, Eretz Yisrael. That creates the paradigm. A chovas haguf, a mitzvah, ultimately again incumbent upon the individual, applies in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. But a chovas karka, right, an obligation triggered by the land, only applies in Eretz Yisrael itself. Beautiful. That's the limud. So we'll say, let's go back there. Chutz min ha'olav ha'kalayim. So interestingly enough, right after we go ahead and we finish creating this rule, creating this paradigm, what do? Now we note the exceptions to it. Because we'll say, based on what we learned before, what would we say about Arla and Kilayim? What was about Arla and Kilayim? Where do they apply? In Eretz Yisrael. Yet, again, the Mishnah said, Tanakama said, Chutz mina Arla v'Kilayim. So says the Gemara, Ibayluhum. So we'll say, so fine. So actually, interestingly enough, the Gemara kind of bypasses that for just a little bit and actually goes to the end of the Mishnah. Again, we'll discuss why Arla and Kilayim are different. We're going to see why they're different. But we're now bypassing that, going to the end of the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer said, Af chadash, even chadash. Even chadash. So now the Gemara says, what is he saying? Rabbi Eliezer lekula palig or lechumra palig? Is Rabbi Eliezer coming to go ahead and be more megal, more lenient than Tanakama, or is he coming to be more machmir? What exactly is it that he is saying? Watch this. Lechumra palig. Maybe he's coming to be machmir, and he says like this: Vachi kamer, Tanakama, chutz mina arla umina kilayim tehilchasa gimirila. Right, Tanakama says that ultimately, again, Arla and Kilayim ultimately are one is obligated in them in Chutz La'aretz, even though it would appear that they're Chovas Karka, and that's based on a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Hilchasa Gemirila. It's halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So, right, Hilchasa Gemirila. Avagav de'igel meimar Chovas Karkahi, aval chadash ba'aretz in b'chutz la'aretz lo. But the Tanakama would say, chadash only applies in Eretz Yisrael. So in other words, the Tanakama will say there's an exception for Arla and Kilayim, and we'll discuss the nature of that exception. We'll see why there is. But according to the Tanakama, Chadash, I should say, the prohibition to consume Chadash only applies in Eretz Yisrael, not in Chutz La'aretz. My time, what's the reason? Moshav la'ach Yerusha v'yeshiva mashma. Shabbos say the Torah when it talks about the prohibition of chadash uses the lashon of moshav. But say moshav means in your habitation. In your habitation. The Gemara is going to discuss in just a little bit that whenever you see the word moshav means that the mitzvah only applies after the conquering and settling of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so we'll say that's the position of the Tanna Kama. Right, so Tanna Kama holds Arla and Kilayim are an exception; they will apply in Chutz La'aretz, but Chadash does not. Va'asa Rabbi Eliezer lemeimar av Chadash noi bein baretz bein Chutz La'aretz. And Rabbi Eliezer comes along and says no. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees and he says no. Chadash also applies in Chutz La'aretz. My time, what's the reason? Because Rabbi Eliezer understands Moshav b'chol makom sha'atem yoshvim. Because Rabbi Eliezer says the word Moshav means what? Anywhere you live. Anywhere you live. As such, the prohibition of Chadash will apply anywhere we live. So remember, what are we trying to figure out over here? We're trying to figure out what Rabbi Eliezer, how we understand his statement in relationship to the Tanna Kama. So first possibility is, Rabbi Eliezer is coming to be Machmir. And Rabbi is coming to be Machmir, he's coming to Machmir and say, Tanna Kama says, only Arla and Kilayim apply in Chutz La'aretz, but Chadash does not. And Rabbi Eliezer says, yes it does. Yes it does. Why? Because the word Moshav in your habitation means anywhere you live. Anywhere you live. Fine. O Dilma, the other possibility is, L'kula Palik. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer is actually coming to be Mekel. Going to be Mekel. How so? V'achi kamer Tanakama, chutz mina arla v'akilayim dehilchasa gimirila, v'kol shekein chadash demoshav kol makom sha'atem yoshvei mashma. Suppose I watch this. Maybe the halacha is like this. Maybe Tanakama is saying it. So I was supposed to get ready for this. Tanakama is saying this. Arla and kilayim apply in chutz la'aretz, and that is a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Certainly chadash applies in chutz la'aretz. Why? Because by Chadash you find the word Moshav. What does Moshav mean? What does Moshav mean? Anywhere you live. So we'll say in this version here, the Tanna Kama doesn't even have to mention Chadash because of course Chadash applies in Chutz La'aretz. And comes along Rabbi Eliezer, Chadash eino noeg ela ba'aretz. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer is coming along and saying Chadash only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Why? To Moshav la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva mashma. Because ultimately, again, the word Moshav means something only applies after Eretz Yisrael is conquered and settled. Conquered and settled. Umay af. And when he says af, when Rabbi says af in the Mishnah, what does af mean? Akamaisa. Akamaisa means it's referencing back to the original part of the Mishnah, namely that mitzvos that are a chovas karka only apply in Eretz Yisrael. So we'll say, see, hear this? Two different ways to read Rabbi Eliezer, which essentially means two different ways to read the Tanna Kama. In version 1, the Tanna Kama is saying only Arla and Kilayim apply in Chutz La'aretz because it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai, which we haven't discussed, which we'll see. Right? Chadash, according to the Tanna Kama, doesn't apply in Chutz La'aretz. Why? Because by Chadash the Torah uses the word Moshav, and Moshav means only after the settling and conquering of the land, which means Chadash only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Eliezer comes along to say, no, Chadash does apply in Chutz La'aretz as well, because the Torah uses the word Moshav. Moshav means wherever you live. That's version 1. So in version 1, Rabbi Eliezer is coming to be Machmir. In version 2, the Tanna Kama says, Arla and Kilayim apply in Chutz La'aretz, and of course Chadash applies in Chutz La'aretz. Of course it does. Why? Because the Torah uses the word Moshav, and Moshav means wherever you live. And Rabbi Eliezer is coming to say, no, Chadash does not apply in Chutz La'aretz. Chadash is part of the category of Chovas Karka, and Moshav means only something that applies after this conquering and settling of the land. So we'll say, so what is Rabbi Eliezer coming to say? Incredible. So let's analyze. We'll say, so Tashma. So we'll say we are now 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom. So Tashma, Dam Rabbaye, Man Tanan de Palagali, Rabbi Eliezer. Who is the Tana who argues on Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel. We'll say, no, what did Rabbi Shmuel say? Tisanya, the Lamdecha, Shakamakam Shene'amar Bo Moshav, Eino Ela La'achar Yerusha V'Yeshiva, Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Shmuel holds that halacha l'maaseh, anytime the Torah uses the word Moshav in your habitation, ultimately again Moshav always means after Yerusha and Yeshiva, after the land is conquered, right, inhabited and divided. So Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, Hare Shabbos shene'emar bo moshavos, v'nohagas bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. He'll say, but one second, the Torah by Shabbos says, b'chomosh v'osechem, right? Lo sevaru ish b'chomosh v'osechem yom HaShabbos. And I will say, we know Shabbos applies everywhere. Shabbos doesn't just apply in Eretz Yisrael. So what do you do with that? Amarli Shabbos kal v'chomer. Asya. Shabbos is learning that from kal v'chomer. Ma mitzvos kalos nahagos bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So we'll say, quote unquote, more lenient mitzvos ultimately again apply both in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. Shabbos chamir l'kol shekein. Certainly Shabbos applies. So the Gemara says, I will say, now watch this. Now let's pause here for just a second. So I will say, remember again. So Abaye. Mida Amra Abaye, Mantanan the Polyglade Rabbi Shimon. So the fact that Abaye says that Rabbi Shmuel is the opinion who argues on Rabbi Eliezer, right? Rabbi Eliezer, sorry, right? And I will say, what does Rabbi Shmuel hold? Rabbi Shmuel holds that wherever the Torah uses the lashon of Moshav. Moshav means what? Moshav means what? Something only applies after the conquering and settling of the land, right? Which means, Rabbi say, that it must be that Rabbi Eliezer himself holds that Moshav means wherever you live. Wherever you live. Shmamina, Rabbi Eliezer l'chumra palig shmamina. So we'll say, now watch this. Now we just answer our question. So therefore it turns out Rabbi Eliezer will say is of the opinion that Moshav means wherever you live. It applies wherever you live. As such, we'll say, how do you read the Mishnah? Here's how you read the Mishnah. Tanakama holds, Arla and Kilayim apply in Chutz La'aretz. Why? Halach l'Moshe miSinai. But the Tanakama holds, Chadash does not apply in Chutz La'aretz. Rabbi Eliezer holds, yes, it does. Why? Because ultimately, again, Rabbi Eliezer holds that the word Moshav means wherever you live. Since the Torah uses the word Moshav by Chadash, ultimately, again, halach l'maisa, it applies in Chutz. So Rabbi say, Rabbi Eliezer is coming to be machmir. Tanakama holds Chadash doesn't apply in Chutz La'aretz. Rabbi Eliezer holds yes, it does. By the way, I just want to point out to you, just to understand, this is such an important sugya. Rabbi say, to this day, there are people who are makbid, there are people who are careful on Chadash, there are people who are not. So he'll say, it always sounds like a strange thing. Makbid on Chadash, not makbid on Chadash. Tell me, are you makbid on Shabbos, not makbid on Shabbos, right? How do you come? He'll say, so it's always interesting. He'll say, so again, I just want to point out we have a lot more to do, but this is it. This is the discussion. Does Chadash apply in Chutz La'aretz or not? So this is the machlokes. Tanakama says it does not. Moshav means only in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Eliezer, yes, it does. Moshav means wherever you live. So incredible. So let's go back there. Umichti. So let's analyze a bit. Michti, Rabbi Shmuel Eichal. We'll say, what does Rabbi Shmuel, when Rabbi Shmuel is talking about Moshav, what is he actually referring to? Anesachim. He's referring ultimately, we'll say, to the obligation to bring wine libations. So we'll say, Benesachim, Bia on the base, Benesachim, Bia Moshav Ksivu. We'll say, by Nesachim is different because by wine libations, the Torah uses both the lashon of Bia and Moshav. Right, the Pasuk says, Kisavo el eretz moshvo sechem. So we'll say, by Nesachim, by wine libations, there's a double lashon. There's a double lashon of entry into the land and settling the land. Hachikamer, this is what it means to say, L'lamed shekom mokom shene'emar bia umoshav, Eino ela la'achi Yerusha v'yeshiva de Rabbi Shmuel. So we'll say ultimately again, what it means to say is that Allah Rabbi Shmuel is saying wherever the Torah says via and Moshav, entry and settling, that comes to teach you that halacha l'maisa, the mitzvah only applies after the land was conquered, divided, and settled. Iachi Amar Rabbi Akiva, Hari Shabbos Shneimar B'Moshavos. They'll say the problem is Rabbi Akiva is like this. Rabbi Akiva will say now it happens to be. Okay, we'll come back. If we have time, I want to talk to you about Nesachim for just a moment. Let's just get through a little bit more. So Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Shmuel, here's the problem with your statement, right? So Rabbi Akiva wants to say, wherever the Torah says Bia and Moshav, ultimately that means that the mitzvah only applies after the land is conquered and settled. What about Shabbos? What about Shabbos, where it says Moshavos? V'amarle Shabbos kal v'chomer. Ultimately, again, so Rabbi Shmuel says Shabbos is kal v'chomer. Right? If mitzvos kalos, if simpler mitzvos or easier mitzvos, more lenient mitzvos apply in chutz la'aretz, certainly more machmir mitzvos apply as well. So Neimolei ana bia umoshav kamina. So I will say, instead of answering with the kal v'chomer, why didn't Rabbi Shmuel say Rabbi Akiva? I'm only talking about mitzvahs where it says bia and moshav. Shabbos has moshav but doesn't have bia. So the Gemara says chada va'od kamarle. So Rabbi Shmuel was saying two things. Number one, chada da'ana bia moshav kamina. Number one, Rabbi Shmuel is saying, I'm only saying that mitzvahs only apply in Eretz Yisrael right after the conquering and settling, when the Torah says bia and moshav. Shabbos doesn't say that. Therefore, Shabbos applies everywhere. Furthermore, the Gemara was va'od the amrit hari Shabbos nar b'moshavos Shabbos kavachomeri. Fine. Shabbos says the Gemara. So Rabbi Shmuel was essentially advancing two reasons as to why Shabbos applies in chutz la'aretz. Reason number one is that Rabbi Shmuel says, I only hold that halacha l'maaseh something is dependent on the land when it says bia and moshav. Shabbos has moshav, not bia. Furthermore, there's a kal v'chomer that says that Shabbos applies in chutz la'aretz as well. Shabbos say, my kamiflagi. What are Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel arguing about? Well, I'll say this is incredible. Bekirvu nisachem b'midbar kamiflagi. Shabbos say what they're arguing about was, were there wine libations in the desert? Right? We know again that there were karbanos in the desert. Were there nesachim? Ultimately, were there wine libations in the desert? Rabbi Shmuel Silber lo kirvu. Rabbi Shmuel says ultimately again. Now, I will say Rabbi Shmuel's individuals, right? There were no nesachim in the desert. Rashi says Rabbi Shmuel Silber lo kirvu nesachim b'midbar. V'afal gav d'chsiv b'miluim v'zeh asher tasal mizbeach u'ksiv bein nesachim ba'olas hatamid b'karban sibrahu dahavu aval hayichidim lo neschayvu b'nesachim ela mebias haaretz ve'elach la'achiru shavi yeshiva. So Rabbi Shmuel says like this. Rabbi Shmuel says, while there were wine libations brought as part of communal offerings, there were no wine libations brought as part of individual offerings in the desert. That only began upon entry into the land. Right? The Gemara says, so lo kivu nesachim b'midbar. Rabbi Akiva savar kivu nesachim b'midbar. Rabbi Akiva says, no, there were wine libations offered up even in the deserts. Shabbos said that's the machlokes. Amr Abaye, Hay Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, Mafik Mi'idach Tana de Rabbi Shmuel. Here's the problem. This version of Rabbi Shmuel contradicts another version of Rabbi Shmuel. The Tana de Rabbi Shmuel we learned, Ho'el v'nemru bios b'Torah stam. Uparat lecha be'echad mehen. So I'll say there are many times ultimately again where the word bia, right, entry, is used in the Torah stam. And ultimately again, yet by one of them, one of them is more specific. I will say which one of them is more specific. Look at Rashi. So we'll say one time when there's lashon of bia entry, there's also more explicit lashon of yirishta. You will inherit it and you will settle it. So what does that teach us? So the Gemara says. So what does that teach us? Afkol la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva. So I will say this opinion of Rabbi Shmuel says like this. Normally, you find the lashon of kisavo entry into the land many times. One time, the Torah used lashon of bia with Yerusha and yeshiva. What does that come to teach us? That every single time there's lashon of bia, entry always means after conquering and settling. V'idach mishum dahava melech bikurim shnei ksuvim abayim kechad. The other will say, no. A king, the mitzvah of a king, and the mitzvah of bikurim, they will say are both mitzvahs that only apply after you enter and settle the land. But there are two concepts. And as we've seen before, in Melandin, we can't learn out, or we'll say a rule from two instances in which the Torah states the same principle. The other opinion will say, they're both. Why? Because of Rachman HaMelech, v'lo kasa bikurim. Had the Torah just written a king and not written bikurim, hava mina bikurim to come as hanila altar. I would have said ultimately again bikurim. You get benefit immediately upon entering the land and from the fruit, and therefore maybe halacha l'maisa, the mitzvah does apply immediately. The kasav bikurim v'lo kasav melech, and I had just written bikurim and not melech. Havamina melech dedarko lechabesh la'altar, a king who is necessary to lead the army to conquer. Maybe you appoint him immediately upon entering into the land. The idach, the other opinion would say, Nichtov Rachmana Melech, v'lo bai bikurim, just write king, and don't worry about bikurim. V'ana amin, and I would say, Uma Melech, Telechabesh, la'achir yeshiva, just like a king who's necessary for conquering, but only applies after you conquer and settle the land. Bikurim l'kol shekin. Certainly bikurim only applies after the conquering and settling of the land. The idach, the other opinion would say, ikasef haki, if it would say that, hava mina mida dahavi achala, I would have looked at chala. I will say, look at Rashi, chala, ta'kol modim shenischayvu ba miyad. You're obligated to separate chala as soon as you enter into the land. So kamash malon. V'hashta, the amrit chova sagov. So we'll say, so fine. So stop here for just a moment. So we'll say, so again, that was a little bit just of a tangent with two different opinions of Rabbi Shmuel. But I will say, here's what we have. Just to be clear what we have. What we have is a fundamental machlokas Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer about chadash. Here's what everybody agrees with. Right? So always concerned what do I agree with. What do I agree with? Here are the categories of mitzvos. Chovas aguf, which means mitzvos that you perform with your person, and therefore again apply chutzaras Eretz Yisrael. Category 2, chovas karka, which are mitzvos that what? Right? So we'll say we're going to reform our lashon. It's not just that they're incumbent upon the land, because also I'll give you an example. Even Shemitah, which is the paradigmatic mitzvah tulia ba'aretz, Shemitah is on me. In other words, the mitzvah is on me. The better way to say chovas karka is mitzvos which are triggered by the land. Right? So if I don't have land, I have nothing to observe Shemitah with. If I don't have produce, I have nothing to give Trumas and Maasros from. So Chovas Karka means mitzvos triggered by the land. And where do those mitzvos apply? Where do those apply? Only in Eretz Yisrael. There's two exceptions. What are the two exceptions? Arla Kilayim. Why? We don't know yet. We don't know yet. Sounds like Halacha Moshe Sinai. Machlokes case, Chadash. And what does the machlokes depend on? How you interpret the word, and this is going to be tomorrow, we're going to see this more closely in tomorrow's daf, how you interpret the word Moshav. Tanakama says Moshav means B'chol Makom Sha'ata Yoshev, wherever you live. Wherever you live. So wherever you are, there's a mitzvah of Chadash. Rabbi Eliezer will say, no, Moshav means La'achar Yerusha V'yeshiva, after the land is conquered. After the land is conquered, therefore Chadash only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Fine, so we'll say, so now, we just introduced another opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. So we'll say, this actually is interesting. We should then open up another machlokes, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. What's the machlokes? We'll say, what's the machlokes? The machlokes ultimately, again, is were there nesachim, were there wine libations in the desert or not? Rabbi Shmuel says no. Rabbi Akiva says yes. And that kind of opened up a whole bunch of different stuff. Incredible. So we'll say, so let's go back to a little bit. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, what did we get up to? So we'll say now that we say that a chovas aguf, okay, I have one more thing to about Nesachim, but okay, we'll just go back there for 1 minute. I have to tell you this before we daven. So Gemara says as follows: So we'll say, so now that we say that right, chovas aguf, a mitzvah incumbent upon the person, applies in Israel and Chutz La'aretz, Moshav the Kasev Rachmana Gabi Shabbos Lamali. So why does the Torah use the lashon of Moshav by Shabbos? Right? Why use that lashon at all? B'chol Moshav Seichem. To which the one is listening to this one is incredible. Itzrich Sa'arayt Chamina Hoil Ubinyana Demodos Ksiva Tibai Kiddush Kimodos. But I might have thought that since Shabbos is written in the section of the Yomim Tovim, I might have thought that maybe Shabbos needs a declaration just like Yom Tov. What does it mean about saying? How do you get a Yom Tov? What has to happen in order for Yom Tov to occur? Beis Din has to be Mekadesh the Chodesh. They have to sanctify the new month. And I will say, how does Beis Din sanctify the new month? They must make an active declaration of Mikudash. Right? They must make that declaration. I might have thought that because Shabbos ultimately is in the same section of the Yom Tovim, maybe it requires a declaration of, Shabbos, just like Yom Tov. Kamash Malon, no, the Gemara says, Kamash Malon, Moshvo Seichem. And Moshvo Seichem means you create Shabbos in your own homes. I.e., there does not need to be a declaration of Beis Din. We'll say, isn't that fascinating? That's what Moshe Seicha means. Not only does Shabbos apply anywhere, we know Shabbos applies anywhere, but Moshe Seicha means we don't need a declaration from Beis Din. Shabbos is something that occurs in, look at Rashi, Tibai, Kiddush, Beis Din, for lo nog, Kiddush, Elabiyu, the Kidamar. Good. So therefore, I will say, Halacha L'maisa, Moshe means that Halacha L'maisa, you declare, you quote unquote, Shabbos doesn't need an official declaration from Beis Din, rather you establish it. So just last minute we have, we'll stop over here for today. I have to share with you a ridiculous medrash. Ridiculous medrash. So I will say this is machlokes. Did Nesachim apply in Eretz Yisrael, in the Midbar or not? Midbar or not. So ultimately, again, there's the machlokes, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shmuel says no. Rabbi Akiva says yes. So I will say, so ask the medrash, where did they get wine for Nesachim in the desert? Where did they get wine for Nesach in the desert? So there's different opinions in the Medrash. Let's get ready for this. Medrash and Shir Hashirim, the Gemara says, Rabbi Levi Amar min ha'eshkol, from the cluster of grapes that the Meraglim brought back from Eretz Yisrael. Right? The cluster of grapes that the Meraglim brought back, which was a Gezunta cluster, right? That gave them wine for the 40 years in the desert. Gave them wine 40 years in the desert. And I was saying, is that not incredible? And what a fantastic Musar Haskell. That cluster of grapes was the source of the undoing of Klal Yisrael. Right? It was those very grapes that ultimately allowed the Meraglim to say, look at this. This is like Chernobyl over here. What's going on over here? It's ridiculous. It's crazy. It's terrible. Right? This fruit this doesn't represent bracha. This represents abnormality. It's too big. It's too much. It's too abnormal. That's what got everyone worked up and got everyone to rebel against Klal Yisrael. And yet, that very cluster is what fueled Nesachim for 4 decades. I will say, what's the Musar Haskell? The Musar Haskell is sometimes it's the very things that undo us. It's the very things that are our weaknesses, the very things that are the cause for our averos, that are the cause for our missteps and misdeeds in life, that become the very vehicles for our personalistic growth. I will say this is the concept of tshuva. What's the power of tshuva? The power of tshuva is the ability to take my averos and learn from them. I know what my weaknesses are. I know the chinks in my armor. I know what I have to work on. I know the areas that need attention. I know the areas in which I am deficient. I know the areas in which I have to improve. And now that I know all of my weaknesses, and now that I know all of my misdeeds, now that I know exactly my Achilles heel, I now can work on those things, that undoing all of those misdeeds, because they've identified for me the areas that I have to work on, become the very source of my strength. My cluster of grapes could become my nesachim. The very things that led to my previous undoing could become my present sources of strength. Allow your eshkol, allow your grapes to become your nesachim. All right, we'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach.
Why do you think Rashi included avodas kachavim in his when he's defining mitzvahs taluyah that apply to both Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz?
Because there is